Afternoon. This webinar offers closed captioning. To enable closed captioning, click on the blue widget or the CC in the box located on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Welcome to the City of Chicago Department of Business Affairs and Consumer Protection webinar. We have adapted our regular business education workshops at City Hall into these webinars until further notice. Please note, any website or email that I mentioned will be posted in the chat box. All BACP offices are open to limited members of the public. Masks are required in all BACP facilities. For those seeking business license assistance, we strongly encourage the processing of license and permits online. Business license can be applied for or renewed online at chicagobusinessdirect.org, or you can call 312-74-GO-BIZ. If you are a part of the BACP Entrepreneur Certificate Program, you can get credit for joining this webinar by sending an email to bacpoutreach@cityofchicago.org. To learn more about this program, please visit chicago.gov/business education. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be available at youtube.com/Chicago BACP. We'd like to encourage all attendees to ask questions. Please use the chat box and send your questions to all panelists. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. Today's webinar is entitled Fund Your Startup into a Real Business, presented by SCORE. At this time, I will now turn this webinar over to Hannah for us to begin.
Thank you so much, Stella and the BACP team. We greatly appreciate our continued partnership and collaboration. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Fund Your Startup into a Real Business webinar. If you want to know the various options to fund your startup, then you're in the right place. My name is Hannah Fernandez, and I'm the chapter chair of SCORE Chicago. SCORE has been around as a resource partner of the SBA since 1964, providing free and confidential business mentoring for business owners across the country. So whether you are a new entrepreneur or you've been in business for a long time, our SCORE mentors could help you start, grow, and scale your businesses. To schedule an appointment with our mentors, go to our website at chicago.score.org. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Jeff Nicholson. With over 33 years of commercial and investment banking experience, Jeff was responsible for client coverage activities of diversified companies in the central United States. He has had the opportunity to observe and work with managers and owners across a wide range of industries, from large public multinationals to small privately held companies. During 17 of those years, he was also a successful adjunct instructor at both the undergraduate and graduate levels in both management and finance. Jeff, you're on.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate your listening in today. I'm going to be your guide for financing your startup. You know, when I was first asked to put this webinar together, I said, really? All you need to do is to sketch out a great idea on a napkin and people will throw money at you, right? Well, apparently not. Let's start with this. Money is like gasoline during a road trip. You don't want to run out of gas. This was a quote from Tim O'Reilly, who was the founder of O'Reilly Media. It was the first internet web portal built in 1993. Our goal today is to learn a lot more about financing startups. And most people who claim to know really don't know diddly about it. So today we are going to cover a lot of material. We're going to go a mile wide and an inch deep, so strap yourselves in. I want to step back and think about the big picture here. So look at these stages during the life cycle of a startup business. There's roughly 9 stages that I'm showing here. Now this workshop will only deal with the 5 highlighted stages that are shown with the red halo. Most of the stuff that you can read, most of the things that you can find on the internet, and most of the workshops you can go to are all about those other stages that are not highlighted. So let's get started. Inc. magazine went to its 500 founders. These are the 500 fastest growing privately held companies in America, and asked them to think back to their first year in business and identify the biggest mistake or biggest challenge that they faced. As you can see, number one on their list by 45% of those founders said the shortage of capital was their biggest challenge or biggest mistake. You can also see how distant number 2 and 3 were. So this webinar was put together in part because this is such a major issue for startups. Now the SBA, Small Business Administration, they say that the average cost of starting a business is roughly 30 grand, and that most will be able to launch their business with well under $100,000. Now, a sound business plan includes in it very specific financial projections, including all the total startup costs. But I'll caution you that estimating startup costs is as much about sales forecasting as it is about expense projections. Investors and lenders will want to know specifically where their funds are going to be used. So you begin the funding search with yourself. No one is going to invest in your business if you're not willing to invest in your business. And that's what we call bootstrapping. After that, you have to get out a pad of paper and begin to list other sources that you might be able to tap. And a key objective of this workshop is to help you formulate that list of possibilities. Now, as you'll be putting your thoughts together on what those sources are, and I say plural sources, that's my big first advice. You also need to cultivate a funding strategy. And by strategy, I mean three things. One, what are the mix of sources that you're going to plan to use? Two, what are the specific milestones in your journey that determine how much and when the funding will be needed? And three, how do you plan to approach each source in the process? Now, if you return to that survey I talked about earlier, one of the other questions they asked was, how much money did you use in that first year? And if you look, those answers aren't far off from what the SBA said. Only 18% replied $50,000 or more, and well over half said less than $10,000. So if you look at what those founders, where they got the money, 71% of them sourced funds from their own personal savings. That's bootstrapping. Now, 21%, the second largest source, was from family and friends. And we're going to talk about that one today. If you add up both the personal and home equity loans, that's 25. But in those particular cases, those founders were putting their personal assets at risk and not just the business assets. So that's taking a lot of risk. 9% is the angel funding, and we will talk about that. But you'll notice there wasn't a single bank on that list. And only 3% was SBA guaranteed loans. Now, with that as background, you might be thinking, okay, how do I get started on all of this? Well, I would start by trying to answer these two questions. How much money is needed, and how will it be used? Now, I mentioned startup costs earlier, and I wonder if you can really tell me what startup costs actually are. Most people make the mistake of thinking that startup costs only accumulate until the business is launched. No, that's not true. It's really all the cash outlays until break even is reached. Now take a look at this graph. On the far left edge is the launch, day one. But afterwards, after your launch, your business will still need to operate until you reach break even. And that's where the yellow arrow is. So until you reach break even, you need to cover or fund any operating losses until your dream becomes profitable. Now, the only other thing to recognize here is that to complete this exercise, to build this chart with financial projections, you must forecast sales. That's an important part of calculating your startup cost. The reality is, not only those initial cash outlays for that one-time expenses like getting your business registered and all of that, it also includes capital expenditures. So if you're going to buy a piece of equipment, that doesn't show up on your income statement. That's reflected on the balance sheet. And again, you have to fund the operating losses until you break even. Somebody's going to have to pay for that. And the last item is net working capital. Now, you may not be that familiar with that term, but let's see if I can describe it for you. Assume for the minute that you're a manufacturer and you're starting a business. So what you're going to do is you're going to try to get some raw materials that you're going to process into some finished goods, and then you're going to sell those to some new customers. But because you're a startup, when you go to get the raw materials from ABC Company says, we want to check up front, friend, before we ship anything. So day one, the money goes out the door, you send a check to ABC Company, and a week later, they get your check, they process it, they package up your raw materials, and they ship them to you. Let's take it, maybe it takes another week for you to get the shipment. Once you've collected all your raw materials, you're going to make them into some finished goods. So you have some processing, some manufacturing that you're going to go through. And let's assume it takes 2 weeks to make all those raw materials into the finished good. Now you're going to go out and sell them. Maybe it takes a week to sell all those goods. Now, wait a minute. You had the money go out day one, 2 weeks to get the raw materials, another two weeks to process and sell. Okay, 4 weeks have already gone by, and you haven't collected a dime, but the money still went out the window day one. Now, when you sell to some good customers, you want to collect from them, and they say, hey, you know what? Our normal terms are net 30. So they're not going to pay you for another 30 days. And by the time you get those checks and get them processed and you collect the money to put in your checking account, it might be 9 or 10 weeks have passed. So that 9 or 10 weeks of money out the door has to be funded somehow. And that's really the best way I know how to describe net working capital. And that's all part of what it accumulates into your startup costs. So it includes those two pieces. One is those one-time startups, and then the monthly operating expenses and other things connected until you break even. And if your household depends on the success of your startup, you have to include personal living expenses as well. So again, you have to fund yourself until you get to that yellow arrow. After that, hopefully the profits will fund your business thereafter. Now, here's a couple of other tips. You have to plan for some contingencies or the unexpected in your budget. Now, if you're building a commercial building, you've got some architects that have a great deal of experience designing dozens of buildings. You've got engineers that have prescribe everything that goes inside those buildings for decades. And then you've got contractors that are building, and they've built 20 of these things in the last 5 years. But a bank is not going to provide a construction loan for that building unless they're confident that there's enough contingency funds in the budget. And usually that's somewhere between 8 and 12%. So you need to provide some estimate of something that is going to cost you that you're not expecting. Or it could be a lack of sales that you don't reach because you're expecting. But in any event, you have to plan for those contingencies. You shouldn't skip on necessities. Some people decide, well, maybe I don't need insurance out of the box, but you don't want to skimp on those. You can always consider ways to economize later. And you need to get a reality checker too. And that's where it's great to be able to get a mentor from SCORE to look at your startup cost projections, think about the assumptions you write down that go behind them, and they can give you some feedback about what makes sense. Now, everybody write this down. www.5minuteclasses.com. 5-minute classes, all one word. When you go to that website, you're going to want to look for a YouTube video called How to Calculate Startup Costs. It's a great video. By the way, it's only 5 minutes. But it also has some suggested worksheets that you can follow in pulling together your startup costs. I'd also suggest that throughout your whole financial journey here as a startup, you keep a couple of other things in mind. One is always try to get your customers to give you a deposit or to prepay for their order, because that helps finance that net working capital. And always keep in mind, you want to try to get terms from your supplier. You might not get it up front because you're a startup, but continually ask, can you get, net 10, net 7? Any time that you can delay paying for those raw materials or supplies just adds to the ability to be able to finance that net working capital. But first and foremost, if you don't have enough cash to start your business right, wait until you do. And again, if the household is going to depend on this business, you have to incorporate your personal budget. Now, you might be thinking, okay, where do I go to get help in assembling all this stuff? Well, SCORE can help you. You can download what I think is the best Excel spreadsheet for compiling financial projections for free. Just go to score.org and then enter financial projections template in the search box. And the search will be a template that you can download to your computer for free. Now, this workbook, not just a spreadsheet, it's a workbook. It has input sheets where you can enter all of your assumptions. And it also provides some suggestions as well. So for the first year, you're going to put in monthly information because you'll be getting monthly financial reports from this Excel workbook. And so you'll be putting in salary information, benefit information, cost of goods sold information, pricing. All of that stuff is input into the spreadsheet. Now, once you get that thing completed, the workbook will generate income statements for you, balance sheets, cash flow statements. There's even a break-even tab, and then they also provide financial ratios, which are helpful. Now, along with downloading this workbook, you can also download a 40-page user guide. And that gives you a great deal of background and assistance in trying to fill out the spreadsheet and generate your income statements and balance sheets and all of that. I think there's also a completed version of the workbook for a nursery company. I think that's Ann's Nursery. So you can get the workbook itself. You can get the user's guide and an example of what it looks like when it's all completed, all downloaded. And I really don't think that there's a better Excel workbook out there. But I think you should spend some time reading through the guide. And we're not going to spend any time going through it today. Frankly, we could spend a week going through the workbook. But you need to get familiar with it because it will really be a big boost for pulling together your financial information as a meaningful component to your business plan. So let's just switch gears for a minute. The likelihood that your startup will get financed by a bank is slim to none. In over 30 years of banking, I only financed one startup. And this was a startup that wanted $1 million loan. And the only way that I did it and got approval for it was to have $1.5 million of stock by the founder's father pledged to me. And I not only had it in my vault, but I also had the father sign stock powers over to the bank so that I could sell those stock securities at any time I wanted to pay back the loan. That's how I made a startup. So why is it so tough to get a loan from a bank as a startup? Well, let me see if I can explain it to you. Let me first ask you to put on an investor's hat. So as an investor, you want to buy stock in a public company. And why do you want to do it? Because you want to benefit from the upside that this company will have. You want to buy stock in the next Google, the next Amazon, right? But you know, if you buy stock, you could lose everything. But you're willing to take that risk because you hope the upside will make you a lot of money. And if it's an Amazon stock you bought early, it did. Now, take your investor hat out and put on a banker hat. Because now I'm going to help you understand how a bank really thinks. When they lend you money as a business, the bank too could lose everything. But the bank does not have an opportunity to participate in the upside of your business. Their upside is limited by the interest rate they charge. So fundamentally, they're not going to see any upside, but they've got the chance to lose everything. And because they can't participate in the upside, the bank wants two reliable sources of repayment in order to make the loan. And the first one is usually cash flow of the company. So they look at your projections, they'll criticize them themselves, they'll maybe reshape them based on their own experience and what they think is more likely to happen. And if they don't like the cash flow outcome, meaning that they don't think you've generated enough cash to pay you back, to pay them back, they won't even begin to do any more analysis. They'll just say no. But if they think that even with their downside case, that you have a successfully cash flowing business to support their loan, they still won't make it unless they have a second way to get their money back. And usually that's the liquidation of collateral. So if you think back on our net working capital example, we talked about having raw materials, finished goods, some machinery, some receivables from the customers. So if the business stops and the bank has to go in to get repayment, they want to be sure that if they have an auction on your raw materials, on your equipment, on your finished goods, on any real estate, that they will get enough money back to pay themselves off. And if they don't feel confident enough in the liquidation of the collateral, even if they like your cash flow, they won't make you loan. Now, what does a startup have? Does a startup have any assets? Typically not, because you're looking for money to buy those assets. So you don't have any collateral to start with. And secondly, you don't have any operating history. So if they look at your cash flow projections, they can't gauge the potential success of them by looking at your history because you don't have a history. That's why banks don't lend to startups. But where can you go? Well, here's a list. And each of you should be thinking about multiple sources. So you've got two columns here. The one on the right is debt, which means these are fundamental loans that are given to you, and most of the time you have to pay them back. And on the left-hand side, you've got equity. And these are sources of funds in which you have to give part ownership of your business to the financer in order to get their money. Now you notice this asterisk guaranteed by the SBA down at the bottom. Let's talk about that for a minute. The SBA really doesn't lend any money. What the SBA does is they guarantee the loans made by others like banks and credit unions. So let's go back to net working capital and put your banker's hat back on. And let's assume for the minute that the bank is comfortable with your cash flow projections and feels good about their primary source of repayment, but has some doubts about the collateral liquidation values. And so they're not liable to make that loan. Well, that's where the SBA steps in and says, okay, Mr. Bank, we will consider guaranteeing up to 75% of your loan if you make this deal. And the bank says, okay, now wait a minute. I thought I only had enough of 50 cents on the dollar if I liquidated all the assets of the company. But now the SBA is going to give me 75 cents on the dollar. So if I add those together, I'm making a loan for $1 and I've got collateral support or guarantee support of $1.25. That sounds pretty good. So that's why they'll make the loan, because of the SBA guarantee. Well, let's get into a little more detail. This very busy slide, which by the way, you'll see 4 or 5 more times. I put this together to present to some existing businesses in Chicago several years ago during the Great Recession, where these businesses were not getting very favorable treatment from their current banks. So I put this scheme together, and you'll notice that there's not a single bank on that list. So these are all the different sources that you can go to access capital independent of a commercial bank. Now we're going to focus today on those clouds that are highlighted in grayish blue. Those are the ones that have potential applicability to startups. Now the other clouds are typically only applicable to companies that have been in business for some time. Usually that's at least 12 months to 18 months of successful operations, because you got to have some sort of track record to dip into those other sources. So we're going to start at the top of the list with micro lending. Now, micro lenders are really intermediaries between different sources of funds directed toward disadvantaged areas and the actual needs in those areas. And that's why most of these institutions are not-for-profits, and they are based very local. Now, the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA, requires that banks lend in disadvantaged areas. So banks will contribute to microlenders and even participate directly with them in lending money in order to get CRA credit. Every year they have to pass a CRA test in order to keep their charter. So there's a vested interest in banks to contribute to this whole microlending process. Now, microlenders are certified by the U.S. Treasury Department, and they're certified as Community Development Financial Institutions, or CDFIs. And there are 950 of them in the United States today. 950. Now, some programs can also get support from the SBA, because the SBA has a microloan program where they will guarantee potentially up to 85% of a loan that is extended by a micro lender. And there are 32 of those lenders in Illinois today. Now, the real key here is that your business needs to qualify because of low income or disadvantaged area. And so it's typically very friendly, or micro lenders are very friendly to minorities and to women. And unlike banks, they are also much more friendly to startups. Now, my experience is that much of the micro lending is directed towards real estate and real estate development. But it's also available to startup companies for working capital and equipment purposes. Some of the loans are secured, and predominantly the real estate loans are. Sometimes a cosigner is required, but in many cases, the loans are unsecured. And they're typically $50,000 or less, but the rates vary a lot, depending on the nature of the circumstance, what your business is and whatnot. So the rates vary from as low as 4% to 36%. But in 2019, the microloan program averaged guaranteeing loans of about 15 grand and a rate of 7.5%. So on that busy slide previously, I listed the three biggest players in Chicago: Axiom, Chicago Neighborhood Initiatives, Microfinance Group, and CFA USA. If you want to find out more about microlending, which you should go to the CDFI Coalition, cdfi.org. That's the trade group that promotes microlenders throughout the United States. And you can also go to the Opportunity Finance Network, OFN.org, which is a group of CDFIs that have band together to be larger in scope. And there's some other interesting reading that you can find on their website. But at the end of the day, microlenders are real, and they're real for startups. Now let's switch gears and go to what's pointing at family and friends. When I grew up, my dad said, well, it's not good to mix business and family. So I always believed that. However, the truth is, family and friends invest between $50 and $75 billion a year in U.S. startups. And that amount, that's 2 to 3 times the money invested by Angel Group, and 2 to 3 times of what's invested by venture capitalists in startups. Now, as a participant in this webinar today, as a follow-up, you are going to get a family and friends financing guide. It's a 5-page guide put together by the Chicago chapter and myself, which will provide you abundant detail on how to address this whole topic. And the tricky part here is that you really don't want to lose any money that family and friends have invested in. So you're walking this emotional tightrope by mixing business and friendship. So my advice to start is only go to people who can afford to lose the money. I think this is the most heavily weighted criteria. As a frame of reference, pension funds and institutional investors typically allow only 5% or less of the total portfolio assets to be invested in highly risky ventures. And by that, I mean something like Bitcoin or a startup. So you should use that as a frame of reference. Family members should be kept to similar guidelines. So if Uncle Fred has a net worth of $100,000, you shouldn't be expecting more than $5,000 of support from Fred for your business. So that's kind of an important thing. You really want to take money from sophisticated or well-connected people, because those are the ones that are going to ask you the tough questions and help sharpen your business for long. They're going to benefit you in the long term. Better yet, if you know someone who's actually had experience in running their own business, that's better. And the best thing is if you have a family or friend that has actually invested in a startup. That is really great track record experience for them and for you. You want to avoid taking dumb money, because you want your seed or in initial investors working for you in order to make the next round of financing happen if you need it. So you really don't want to press for money from someone who's uncertain just to get them to open their checkbook, because when things get rocky, they're going to be rocky. So you want to avoid people that are going to have the potential to cause drama or stress. But once you have a good target or more, you want to start by building a relationship first. You want to first get their reaction to your startup concept, because then you'll be better positioned to ask them for money later. But you have to be prepared when you do this. You should have a business plan that includes a focus of validating the market for your product or service, and that also has some financial projections. And you can use milestones for triggering events. So that allows a series of smaller funding requests, and then you have some communication in between on progress. We'll talk more about milestones in a minute. But when you're talking with family and friends, you need to put your cards on the table. Even though you're confident in the success, you have to be honest about the risks that you face. You don't want to make promises you can't keep just to get somebody to open up their pocket. You want to make sure that you demonstrate your passion and your due diligence, particularly as it relates to validating the market for your business. Proving that you have a target market is something that's really critical. And you need to manage expectations. It's best practice to keep a periodic email update to your backers. Be honest about what's going well and about things that maybe aren't going so well. Keep in mind, you may or need to come back to these people again for financial support. So you want to keep that dialogue transparent and robust. Remember, no investor or lender likes surprises, so endeavor to alert each supporter of any suspicions that you have in the change of your expectations. Well, this is what I'm talking about the milestones. It's not just for funding. This is a good way to think about the milestones in your business overall. But in particular, if you're looking to family and friends, this is where you can target how to divvy up the source and uses of funds that you need into smaller pieces as you cross these milestones. So, for example, I like key partnerships as a good one. So as you're putting your business plan together and talking about it with a family and friends potential supporter, you say, well, I need to hire a good website developer. I need to hire a good marketing organization, or I need to hire a fulfillment manager. So when it comes time for your decision on me, you go through the process, you can explain to them, well, I just hired a website designer, and here's the contract we have, here's the people I looked at. Now that I've got this designer going to be working with me, I could use some of the money we talked about in order to help pay for that expense until my business gets launched. So the key partnerships, I think, are really good milestone for that. Developing a prototype is another good one. That's where you demonstrate that you know how to produce what you're producing. Minimum viable product, very prominent in lean startup processing. This is where you develop kind of a low saleable version of what you're going to eventually produce, or even could be in a video. But you're going to go to a group of potential customers and get their reaction to it. So once you have the minimum viable product, that costs you some money to build, but you might wait until after you get the feedback that says, yeah, I got very favorable feedback from the MVP. That's another milestone to go back and get some beta testing. That's where the final testing before launch happens. And even when you make your first sale, that's another reason to go back to minimum things. Anyway, those are some pieces of advice on approaching family and friends, a critical part of financing startups, and you'll get that guide as a follow-up to listening to this webinar. Now let's go back to that busy slide, and let's talk about donation funding, which is a subset of crowdfunding. Now, you all probably know what crowdfunding is, and that's raising money through the collective efforts of individuals and institutions that are coordinated through an internet platform, right? So the key thing here is that money raised through donation funding doesn't have to be repaid. It's not a loan, it's a gift. And donation funding has helped over 1 million startups be launched since it began in the year 2000. So it's been around, it's got a 20-year track record, and it's been very successful. And the biggest players in this arena are listed on that slide. Now, this is where your business plan in the conventional sense might not be as much help as you think. These platforms attract donors that are interested in projects, causes, events, not especially a business venture. So you really need to change your thought process to align with the platform population. And you've got to have a story that connects. Let me give you a great example. There was a woman here in Chicago that wanted to develop a business to transport school-aged children to and from school every day, where the parents are both working. And you can imagine with two working parents how difficult it is to deal with the transportation and everything, getting them to and from work every day. Well, this woman said, I can fix that. I can set up this business in order to make this work. So she went about doing a business plan, getting everything started. And when she went to get insurance for her car, the insurance company said, well, we're going to classify you as a limo business. And because you're a startup, we require a $10,000 upfront premium. Well, she didn't have that. So she went to a funding platform. And how did she tell her story? She talked about all the benefits that she hopes to provide Chicago working families with safe transportation of their children, but the big bad insurance companies are going to charge her a fortune to get started. That was the trick that worked, the key that opened the pockets, the big bad insurance company. So you've got to have a story that connects. Now, each of those platforms has a slightly different kind of approach. So, Kickstarter, for example, which is more technically oriented, they like a lot of rewards. So the rewards could be pre-order the product or get one free. It could be a discount on the first run. But you could also, depending on the platform, give a T-shirt with recognition, or show a list of donors on the website to give somebody some grist. So you really need to evaluate each platform and how it really connects and aligns with what you're able and willing to do. But you have to look at this as more than a one-time event. It's not one time and done. You should treat these givers, treat these donors as real stakeholders. They may assist you in the future. You know, these platforms provide you with a list of donors, the dollars that were given. They provide you vehicles to gather contact information so that you can provide the donors with updates, maybe take surveys of them. So going back to the donor population can be very successful. Peak Design, the company Peak Design, which is a creative maker of outdoor gear, they've gone back 5 times for donations. The 5th time they went, by the way, they raised $4.9 million, which surprised me. But the one thing that I would also caution each of you if you go this route is you have to provide your own outreach program independent of the platform to attract people to the program. You should talk to your family, talk to your friends, you should talk to anybody that you know and tell them, here's the date of the launch, here's what I'm trying to do. I could really use your support. Please tune in and read the presentation and see what's going on. You need to draw your own population to the platform in order to be successful. I can't stress that enough. Now the campaigns can be either fixed or flexible. And that's the difference in the fees you see that are charged. Now, a fixed program like Kickstarter says if you target to raise $50,000 and you only raise $49,500, you don't get anything. The flexible program says you target 50,000 and you only raise 30, you can have the 30, but we're going to charge you a premium price as a consequence of not meeting the budget. And it's usually twice what you would normally see. Now, each time a pledge is made and the donation is made, there's processing fees associated with that. You know, banking and charge card fees, all of that. And that might amount to another 1.5 or 3% that is going to have to come out of the money that you raise. It's interesting, though, that the all or nothing campaigns get fully funded at twice the rate of the flexible ones. But if you think about it, it makes sense. If you're going to work your tail off to raise 50 grand and you come short by $500, you don't get a dime. So you're going to work extra hard in order to get to that 50,000. And so that's why it's more successful. Overall, the fixed funding success is about 50%. But reaching your target, whether it's fixed or flexible, is approximately 80%. So once you pick a sensible target, 8 times out of 10, you'll meet it. Now, the average campaign, as it shows here, raises between 25 and 30,000 bucks, which is the average starting cost of a business according to the SBA. The average pledge is under $100, and the average number of bankers overall is about 47. The fully funded programs usually have about 300 backers. The biggest raise ever was $20.3 million done on Kickstarter by Pebble Technology. They were trying to launch a new smartphone, and they wanted to raise marketing money to do that. Their target was $500,000. So they raised over 20 million. And 2 years later, Fitbit bought Pebble Technology. And the only other thing is that campaigns with videos earn 100% more than those without. Well, that does it for donation funding. Now let's go to angel groups. Now, maybe some of you don't know what an angel is, but they're usually wealthy people and successful folks who are interested in investing their own money in startups and in early stage businesses. And sometimes they work alone, and sometimes they work as part of a group. The best way to think about a shark, about an angel, is to think about Shark Tank, because those are great examples of angels. And this slide shows the top 6 angel groups in Chicago. There is a difference between individual angels and angel groups. Angel groups are much more formal. Typically they anticipate being part of the next unicorn or IPO, where they're going to make a killing. That's what they're looking for. And so I mentioned seed capital earlier. Seed capital is usually the first of 4 funding stages to a growing business. So if an angel investor is looking at being the seed capital for a startup, they really expect it to be a big success. Now, angel investors overall are typically more interested in ownership than just debt capital. So even if they couch their financing overture to you as a loan, typically it will be structured in a way that it can be converted into equity later. Now, they're not interested in running the business day to day. They're routinely satisfied with a minority position in your business from an equity standpoint. So, it's going to be, well below 30 or 40% more than right. And angels have a shorter time horizon than you might think. Their angel groups especially are looking at not being around for more than 2 to 5 years. They want to get out either partially or completely within that period of time. And with angel investors, they provide mentoring support and advisory assistance. Maybe 1 out of 3 is going to be interested in a board seat for decision making. So most of the time, they're really hands off, and that's really a good thing. The average individual investment is less than $40,000, so keep that in mind. It gives you some sense of, as you're comparing an angel investment to a donation investment to a family and friends. All of them have different target amounts. And as you think back, if you watch Shark Tank, the valuation of the business is really the critical component to the success of the relationship between the investor, in this case the angel, and the business founder. Now, we could spend, again, like the workbook, we could spend a week talking about valuation process, and we're not going to do that. You just know that it's a very critical part to understand valuations before you begin considering approaching the angel community, because you have to have a clear sense of that. What's become a lot more prevalent today with angels is that they see themselves as filling the gap between family and friends financing and investments from, let's say, venture capital. And so it's become a little more common practice in the last 5 years that if you haven't raised money from family and friends, an angel group won't even take a look at you. They're saying, hey, listen, if they can't get money out of people that actually know them, why would we want to put our money into this situation? So it's really very important to think about their mindset in terms of where they see themselves in this whole financing process. Now, the reality is, I think there's a greater chance of landing an individual angel investor if your business plan is not targeting a near-term public offer. So if you've got a long horizon, or if you don't ever anticipate going public, then an individual angel investor is your best bet, because you're not going to connect all that well with an angel group. So as you're thinking about, as your plans develop here, and you're saying, gee, I really am looking for patient, permanent capital. I want some mentoring support, and I've got a long time horizon. Individual angels are where you really should be spending your time. But if you're more ambitious and more aggressive, then this is the list of things that you need to have in place in order to attract the attention, let alone the capital, from an angel group. And the first one, your product or service, that's got to be developed or very near completion. So you can't be going to them early on in the process. You've got to be near the end of your business plan. You either have to have some existing customers or confirmed potential customers. And like I said, you've invested your own capital. You've recruited some family and friends funding as well. And your financial projections can demonstrate that the rapid growth you expect in the next 2 to 3 years is going to pay back some debt and give you the cash flow necessary to support an IPO. And to have all that stuff happen with an angel group, you've got to have your business plan in top shape. And that's really important. Now, it's clearly easier to find angel groups than individual angels. I mean, after all, I gave you the top 6 groups in Chicago. So what you really need to start doing is network. You really need to use LinkedIn. If you're not part of LinkedIn, you need to get on it, because that's the way in which you can network into someone in an angel group. The best way to get there is not to send an application, because you're a dime a dozen in that regard. These guys are going to look at anywhere between 300 and 350 deals a year, these angel groups. So they want to get to ones that are going to be potentially good. So they want to refuse as quickly as they can through that list, so that they can get to the 10 or 12 that are really going to be potential. And so the best way to get in to an angel group is to see who's on the leadership team. The angel group will show you the businesses that they're supporting, and you could find out whether or not through LinkedIn or other networking, whether you know someone that is part of that organization that the angel group is supporting, part of that business, because you could maybe network through them to get an introduction. That's really the best way to go. The Angel Capital Association, or ACA, is the trade association that represents angel investors throughout the United States. So they're a great resource to find studies, characteristics, term deals, white papers, anything in the angel environment. You'll find a lot at ACA. Angel.co is an interesting website, because you can actually post for a job with a startup or recruit for your startup through that website. But if you go to the web address listed that has North American investors, you'll find a long list of individual angel investors in North America. And there again, that's where you can begin to try to find a way to network into those people. And I just added this last one, the largest crowdfunding platform in the angel world is Angel Investment Network. And they've got 250,000 investors in this platform, and they lend money in about 80 countries. So it's a big deal. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, he's shown us a number of different sources. I've told you that you should be thinking about multiple sources, not just one, to finance your startup until you break even. And you're probably like, how does all this stuff fit? Well, you will also be getting, as a attendee today, a picture on how startup funding works. It's a rather elaborate scheme that shows you from kind of day one all the way through a potential IPO, how all of these funding sources mix together, or could mix together and complement each other throughout the journey to some destination. So it's too difficult to show on the slide, quite frankly. But you'll get it by email, and it will be a great way to start to tie all of this stuff together and begin to think about, in association with your milestones and the different sources and all that, where indeed you might be able to do that list of sources, develop your strategy, and begin to realize your dream. Well, look, we've got a little bit of time left. So let's go back to those clouds that I said really don't apply so much to startups, because once you launch, then these are things that might be applicable to you as you go forward. So it's a way to introduce you to kind of what I'd call early stage financing. Let's start with alternative lending, which really hasn't been around for that long. But these are the ones you probably have heard about being advertised on the radio and on TV. On Deck, for example, is a publicly held company, and they're big into alternative financing. Cabbage, you've probably heard a lot on the advertising on radio. Lori Greiner from Shark Tank, I think, is an investor because she advertises for them all the time. But why are they not for startups? Well, these lenders want a minimum of 4 to 6 months in business. And that's only if you're a very successful startup from day one. Normally, they're looking for a 12 to 18 month history in order to lend you money. And here it's a platform, right? So you've got a lot of investors sitting on the sidelines that are willing to invest their money through these platforms to get into your pocket. And their focus is on consistent monthly revenues. That's the key thing. So if you have consistent monthly revenues for 4 to 6 months, you might qualify. But typically it takes 12 to 18 months for them to be convinced. And the reason for that is that they take money out of your account every day or every week. And so they want to be assured that there's a consistent replenishing of your account with sales every day or every week, because they want to take the money out. And what they tell you is that, well, we don't charge an interest rate, we charge a factor rate. And so typically they'll say, well, you got to repay 1.2 times what you borrow. Well, I've translated that into some applied APR, and those ranges are anywhere from 30 to 50% annual percentage. So it's really very high. Sounds like Guido, loan shark. However, millennials are using alternative lending a lot. They see a project in which they can get a really big account, and they can complete that production, shipping, and collecting within 6 months. Then, which is usually the tenor of alternative lending loan, and they can still make money, even though it's a narrower margin than they would make without it. They could claim that they've got a new big customer like Target or Ace Hardware, and they've used the financing to buy the materials in order to fulfill the product need. And then they can get out in 6 months and still make a little profit, but now they can claim they get a great fund. So that's a little bit about alternative lending. I've heard Kevin O'Leary all over the TV and cable talking about startengine.com. And they started out by saying, here's a good way for you to get some funding for your startup. Well, don't be deceived. You can't get startup funding from startengine.com. And the real reason is, in order to qualify, you have to have 2 full years of audited financial statements to even file to be part of equity funding. But be aware that there's over 50 of those registered portals here in America. And those are, you can see on the platform, a list of them right down there. And so as you're thinking about, going forward, another source is equity crowdfunding. There's a lot of people out there doing it, but you've got to have that operating history that I talked about, of having 2 years of audited statements in order to qualify. Let's go back to one other, equipment finance. Equipment finance can be used by a startup, and it's potentially very valuable because it really represents 100% financing. And the way to think about it is, if you're buying some equipment, let's say restaurant equipment or copying equipment, printing equipment, rolling stock like a truck, those manufacturers very often have leasing programs. So Navistar, for example, the big truck manufacturer here in Chicago, they have a great leasing business, and a great many of their trucks are sold by lease. So they understand the cost of the product they're making, what the depreciation of that is typically over a period of time, so that they're very good at structuring a lease so that it will still allow them adequate collateral coverage during the life of the product. And so they may indeed be interested in leasing to a startup because they have a leasing arm. Anyway, I wanted to talk about that a little bit. At this point, we've kind of covered what I really wanted to talk about. As I said, this can appear to be very complex with all these different sources, but that picture that you're going to get as a follow-up will really help this come alive for you, I believe. And you'll also get that family and friends financing guide. And keep in mind, that's the second biggest source of startup financing, aside from bootstrapping, so it's very important. We were supposed to learn today a little bit more about how to fund a startup. And I really hope we accomplished that. I said we were going to cover a lot of material. I'm sure your heads are spinning, but you'll get a copy of the slide deck and those other 2 attachments that I mentioned as a follow-up. So again, I appreciate all of you listening, and I hope that if nothing else, I got you really to think about this whole funding business. Thanks, I appreciate your listening.
Okay, I see some questions. This presentation will be available on the Chicago BACP YouTube page. Does all of this information apply for service businesses that do not offer physical products? First question, does all of this information apply for service-based businesses that do not offer physical products?
Yes, I believe service businesses are not that different from manufacturing or production oriented businesses. I mean, you don't necessarily have all of the assets that are part of a business like machinery, equipment of that nature, but then you don't have those funding requirements as well. So most service businesses have some permanent working capital needs and temporary financing needs for being able to fund receivables from people you're providing services to. And so, yes, I think the situations we've talked about, the sources we've talked about, will certainly apply to service businesses as well.
What sort of restrictions can I encounter with crowdfunding for real estate?
For real estate, well, if you're talking about, I assume you're talking about real estate as a startup business. So you're looking to finance real estate through crowdfunding. Um, I, I think it can be done, but I think it would be very difficult to do. Typically, the part that's difficult is that most financing of real estate typically involves the taking of collateral. And in order for a crowd donor to get the benefit of that collateral, just think about the average donation funding has 47 donors. Well, splitting collateral amongst 47 donors is really not a really viable thing to do. If you're looking to get financing, actual financing, I think it's more likely, but recognize that the providing of the collateral issue is I think the big stumbling point, and that's why I think uh, the the financing we talked about initially from those nonprofit organizations is probably a lot more appropriate, because the micro lenders are a single institution, and even if they participate with a bank, they are the ones that would take the collateral for the real estate. So I think that's really your better choice.
Are there some local Chicago banks that you can recommend to open a business checking account?
My recommendation for a startup is to go to a community bank and forget Chase, forget Wells Fargo, forget Bank of America. You know, all of those large institutions are not going to give you any personalized service. I can guarantee it. So you want to go to a community bank where they get to know you and you get to know them. And that's where I would start.
Is there a link for the website and other things that you mentioned that we could have access to?
Um, all of the links that I provided on my slides, I think once you get the slides, I think you can click on the links and they will automatically go. Otherwise, you can just copy them into your web browser. But yeah, all those websites are live. The only one that I mentioned in the presentation was that 5 minutes, what is 5minuteclass.com. And that's the only one that isn't Yeah, 5minuteclasses.com. So write that one down. You can find out more about startup costs. No, I saw a question. When you go to 5-minute classes, you'll be looking for a YouTube video on that website that talks about how to estimate startup costs.
My startup is a social enterprise that aims to make a social impact, but also sells some product on the side to go back into the business. Is there a thing such as social impact investor?
I'm not familiar with it. No.
Is there a benefit to banking with a credit union instead of your standard bank?
Yeah, credit unions are good. I mean, they're good for a couple of reasons. Not the least of which is that they are also local, and they have a great deal of their fabric is to provide personalized service. So credit unions are another good source. Some parts of the city just don't seem to have credit unions. Well, some don't have banks either. But I think a community bank is probably a better long-term choice. But both are equally desirable in order to set up a beginning checking account for your business.
What would you suggest the approach would be if you need funding to purchase land, which is needed to operate your business?
Well, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of what business requires land other than a ranch, and why you would want to buy land for your business. I don't know. But again, the thing that is critical here is micro lenders are probably the best source because they will be able to affect a security filing on the collateral. Any other source would be a little more difficult. Although if you had one Uncle Fred that was willing to help finance the land or finance all of it, Uncle Fred would get the security for the land. But that's the best I can tell you at this point. Vacant land is very difficult to finance, even if you have an ongoing business, by the way. So keep that in mind.
So everything else, it's a lot of comments are thank you for the presentation, thank you for the information. Hannah and Jeff, any last words before we end today's webinar?
Stella, thank you so much. And Jeff, this is such an outstanding presentation. I see that you're always updating the information for the attendees. I really appreciate that because I know that, just a lot of entrepreneurs that would go to us, just knowing where to start, what to avoid, and what works is really crucial to go ahead and save them some time and money and headaches. So I thank you so much, Jeff.
You're welcome.
And Toma, Geraldine, and Stella, I appreciate the amazing work as always. And really to those of you who joined in today, thank you for taking the time to invest in yourself and your business growth. Remember, you're not alone. The City of Chicago, BACP, and SCORE Chicago, we're all here to support you. So please stay connected with us. Keep attending these webinars and really schedule that appointment with one of our mentors because at SCORE, the mentoring sessions are always free. They're always confidential and can be scheduled from our website at chicago.score.org. Hope to connect with all you again. Until then, stay safe and well, everyone.
Good luck, all.
Take care. Thank you.